There it is, the rose you were so proud of last summer, and now it is just sticks. Bare canes, not a leaf left on it. You are standing over it with the watering can, and part of you has already written its obituary. Here is the thing nobody tells you. The mistake you are about to make is not giving up on it. The mistake is feeding it. Because the single most common way people finish off a rose that could have lived is by trying to feed it back to life. The wrong way, at the wrong time. Stay with me, because I am going to hand you 10 natural, almost free things that actually wake a struggling rose back up, but only if you use them in the right order, on the right part of the plant. And I will tell you honestly which 3 famous ones you have heard 100 times are quietly wasting your effort. Let us get your rose back. Let us clear one thing up first, because it changes everything you do next. A rose that looks dead and a rose that is dead are 2 completely different plants. When a rose gets hammered, by heat, by a rough transplant, by a hard winter, by months of being ignored, it does something almost animal. It pulls back. It drops its leaves. It stops blooming. It goes quiet. Think of it more like a bear heading into hibernation. Down in the roots, that rose has been storing sugars all season long. Carbohydrates, its savings account. When times get hard, it stops spending on leaves and flowers, which are expensive to run, and lives off those root reserves while it waits for a better signal. So the rose in front of you is not out of food. It has pulled all of its money down into the roots and is sitting very still. And that one fact is why most rescue advice gets it exactly backwards. Before you give it anything, you need to know there is still life in there, and I want you to test smarter than the usual advice. Take a clean thumbnail or a clean knife and scratch a thin line through the bark of a cane. But do not start at the top. Start low, near the base, close to where the canes swell out from that knuckle we call the bud union. That is the graft, the heart of the plant. Scratch just the top layer. If you see green, moist tissue underneath, that cane is alive, and your rose is dormant, not dead. Now do one thing the other videos skip. Press a finger into the soil right at the base. Is it bone dry? Is it soggy and sour smelling? Because a rose sitting in the wrong moisture has a root problem, and no fertilizer on earth fixes a root problem. Found green near the base? And soil that is merely damp? Good. Now prune away everything above the highest green point, a clean cut on a slight angle, then stop. You are not being cruel. You are telling the plant to quit spending its savings on dead wood it can never use, and pour everything it has left into recovery. Now here is where I have to talk you out of your first instinct. Standing over a weak rose, your instinct is to feed it. Reach for the blue crystals, the miracle powder, the strong stuff. Please do not. Here is the mechanism, and once you see it, you will never unsee it. Those fast, soluble fertilizers are salts. Pour a strong salt solution into the soil around a rose whose roots are already damaged, and you pull water back out of those fine feeder roots by plain osmosis. The very roots the plant needs to rebuild get burned. Growers call it fertilizer burn. On a plant hanging on by its roots, it can be the last straw. And there is a second problem. Most quick feeds are loaded with nitrogen, and nitrogen screams grow, push leaves, push shoots. But a plant with almost no leaves can barely photosynthesize. It cannot pay for that growth. You have handed a command to sprint to something that can barely stand, so it burns through the little reserve it had left on weak, soft growth. And then it really does die. This, right here, is why I say you cannot feed a rose back to life. You can only make its roots safe enough to rebuild themselves. Everything on my list is chosen for exactly that. Gentle on the roots, kind to the soil, patient. This is not feed the plant. We say it the other way round. Feed the soil, and let the soil feed the plant. Down at Texas A&M, horticulturists ran years of trials on roses grown with almost no chemical inputs, leaning instead on healthy soil, compost, and mulch. They call the program Earthkind. What they found, over years, is that roses given a living, well-built soil were tougher, more disease-resistant, and more forgiving than roses kept on a drip of soluble fertilizer. The soil was doing the work. That is the whole game. So let us get to your 10. I have put them in the order I would actually use them on a struggling rose, from the ones that do the most, to steady the roots, down to the nice-to-haves. And I promise you, number 10 is not the one you are expecting. Number 1 is not a fertilizer at all, and that is exactly why it comes first. It is water, done right, under a blanket of mulch, the piece everyone rushes past on the way to the fancy stuff. A stressed root cannot absorb a single nutrient out of soil that is bone dry or waterlogged. So water deeply but not often. A long, slow soak that reaches down where the living roots are. Then let the top inch of soil dry before you do it again. Then lay down 2 to 3 inches of mulch, shredded leaves, leaf mold, bark, but keep it a couple of inches back from the canes so it never holds wet against the stem. That mulch does 3 quiet jobs. It steadies the moisture, so roots are not whipsawed between flood and drought. It keeps the soil cool, so fine roots do not cook. And as it breaks down, it becomes the first slow, gentle food the soil life eats. Free, boring, and the most important thing in this video. Number 2 is finished compost. The dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling kind, laid in a thin ring over the root zone, not dug in. And here is what compost really is, because it is not what most people think. It is barely a fertilizer at all in the numbers sense. Its real gift is that it is alive. A single handful of good compost holds billions of bacteria and fungi. Top dress a struggling rose with it, and you are not force-feeding the plant. You are reseeding the soil around the roots with the workforce that unlocks nutrients naturally and slowly, at a pace a weak plant can handle. It releases so gently there is no salt spike, no burn. This is feed the soil in its purest form. A thin ring, refreshed every few weeks, mulch back on top, and you have built a recovery zone. Number 3 is where we start giving the roots a direct nudge. Liquid seaweed, or kelp extract. And I will be honest with you here. Seaweed is not a miracle, and anyone who tells you it raises the dead is selling something. But it is not nothing either. Kelp carries natural plant compounds, including hormones in the cytokinin family, that are involved in the one thing a recovering rose desperately needs, making new roots and new cells. Real research on seaweed extracts, done over decades and published in peer-reviewed journals, keeps pointing the same modest direction. Genuine help with stress and rooting. And modest is fine, a small push in the right direction, delivered gently. Mix liquid kelp at the rate on the label, usually a capful or 2 in a full watering can, and water it in around the roots. Dilute, gentle, no salt punch. Number 4. Worm castings, brewed into a living extract. Worm castings are simply earthworm compost. Instead of only sprinkling the dry castings, put a couple of handfuls in a bucket of water, ideally with an aquarium bubbler running in it for a day, and let the microbes wake up and multiply. What you pour out is not really a fertilizer. It is an inoculant. You are putting billions of living microbes straight into the root zone. The exact crew a neglected, crashed soil has lost. The science on brewed teas is genuinely mixed, and I will not oversell it. But as a gentle, almost free way to reseed life around a struggling root system, it earns its spot. Water it in. Number 5 is the one almost nobody outside of soil science ever talks about, and I think that is a shame. Because it is quietly one of the best friends a stressed root has. Humic and fulvic acids. These are the dark, stable carbon compounds left behind when organic matter has fully broken down. You can buy them concentrated, often from a soft brown coal called leonardite, and they do 2 things that matter enormously for a hurting rose. Fulvic acid is tiny enough to help roots grab hold of nutrients that were locked up and unavailable, and both of them buffer the soil so that if there is any salt or harshness around those fine roots, its bite is softened. It is fertilizer forgiveness. A small dose in the watering can, per the label, every few weeks. Number 6 is an old rose grower's trick, famous in rose circles for good reason. Alfalfa. The same dried alfalfa sold as animal feed. Steep a couple of handfuls of meal or pellets in a bucket of water for a few days. Fair warning, it will smell. Then water the strained liquid around the plant. Alfalfa carries a natural compound called triacontanol that seems to nudge plants toward fresh growth, and it feeds the soil a little nitrogen as it breaks down. In real gardens, the results run all over the map. Strong for some, quiet for others. But it is cheap and gentle, and when it works from the base. Those fat new shoots low on the plant that tell you the rose has decided to live. Worth a try. Just do not expect fireworks. Number 7. Fish. Specifically cold-processed fish hydrolysate, over the older heat-cooked fish emulsion. Emulsion is mostly a quick shot of nitrogen. Hydrolysate is the whole fish, gently broken down cold, so it still carries the oils, the proteins, and the amino acids, and those feed soil fungi, not just the plant. For a rose trying to rebuild its partnership with fungi in the soil, that is the gentler, richer choice. It is a mild feed, so it will not burn the way the harsh stuff does, but because it does carry real nitrogen, hold it back until you start seeing a few new leaves. No push to grow before the plant can pay for it. Diluted, in the watering can, once the green is coming. Number 8 is a partnership, not a product, the closest thing to a secret engine under a healthy rose. Mycorrhizal fungi. In living soil, certain fungi weave themselves right into a plant's roots and extend that root system many times over, ferrying water and hard-to-reach nutrients back to the plant in exchange for a little sugar. Roses form these partnerships, and a stressed, over-fertilized, or freshly disturbed soil often loses them. You can buy an inoculant, a powder, and the trick is contact. It has to physically touch the roots, so puff a little into the planting hole, or work it into the soil against the root zone. Store-bought inoculants are hit or miss, and if your soil is already alive, you may not need them. But for a rose whose soil has been beaten down, giving those partnerships a chance to reform is worth the few dollars. Number 9 is aged manure, and the two words that matter most there are aged and composted. Never fresh, well-rotted manure, the kind that is dark and odorless and has cooked for months, is a beautiful slow-release feed and a feast for soil life. But I have to plant a flag here for safety, because a lot of you are gardening with grandchildren around and hands in the soil. Fresh manure can carry harmful bacteria, and it can be strong enough to burn roots outright. Only ever use manure that has been fully composted, and wash your hands afterward. Used right, a thin layer worked lightly into the surface feeds the soil for a whole season. But notice, this one is not instant, and I will not pretend it is. It is you making a deposit now that the plant draws on for months. And number 10, the cheapest thing on the whole list, a spoon of blackstrap molasses. You will hear people talk about this one like it is magic, so let me give you the real version. The good and the catch. Molasses is sugar, and sugar is fast food for soil bacteria. Stir a tablespoon into a quart of warm water, pour it around the base, and yes, within days the microbe population booms. But here is what the excited videos leave out. That boom is a quick snack, not a meal, and when bacteria multiply that fast, they grab nitrogen out of the soil to build their own bodies. So for a little while, molasses can actually tie nitrogen up, not release it. It is a spark, not a fuel. So use it the smart way, not on its own, but stirred into your kelp or your compost extract, waking the soil crew up so they deliver the real, slow food, the compost and the mulch, more effectively. A spark to light the fire you already built. That is molasses, done honestly. Now I promised you honesty, so let us talk about 3 famous rose rescue feeds you have heard over and over, and why, for a struggling rose specifically, I would have you set them down. First, the banana peel. Berried peels, banana peel tea. The idea is that you are delivering potassium for blooms. The truth? A soaked banana peel leaches out only a tiny, unpredictable trickle of potassium, and most soil already has plenty. It is harmless folklore, and if you enjoy it, fine, but it will not rescue anything, and I will not pretend it will. Second, Epsom salt. The pitch is that your rose is hungry for magnesium, and a scoop of Epsom salt fixes it. But most soils are not short on magnesium, and yellow leaves have half a dozen possible causes. And remember what Epsom salt actually is. A salt. On a stressed root system, that is the very thing we just warned about. You can add to the same salt load that is already burning those fine roots. Unless a soil test has actually told you that you are low on magnesium, skip it. Third, the box of Bright Soluble Bloom Booster, or any instant miracle feed. It is the salt and nitrogen punch we opened with, aimed straight at the roots least able to survive it. Now here is the honest question worth sitting with. Why do the banana peel and the Epsom salt and the miracle powder get all the videos, while mulch and compost and patience get almost none. It is not a conspiracy. It is quieter than that. Nobody can bottle patience. Nobody can put a fallen leaf in a box and sell it back to you. There is no money in telling you the answer is mostly free and already in your own yard, so nobody buys the ad. The best thing for your rose just happens to be the thing with no marketing budget behind it. So let us make this simple and doable. Week 1, you are not feeding, you are stabilizing. Scratch test, find your green, prune the dead, fix the watering, lay down mulch, then let it breathe. In the first couple of weeks, the only things I would give it are the gentle root helpers that do not push growth. The kelp, the worm-casting extract, maybe the humic acids. Quiet signals to rebuild roots, no nitrogen shouting at it. Then, and only then, when you see the first new leaves unfurl, and that is the plant telling you it can photosynthesize and finally pay for growth, you bring in the light feeding. The compost. The fish once there is leaf, a little alfalfa. Feed the soil while the roots rebuild. Feed the plant only after the leaves come back. Now, expectations, because I will not sell you a fantasy. In the first few weeks, you are looking for small, honest signs. A cane firming up, a red bud eye swelling near the base, the first leaf. By the end of that first season, a rescued rose is usually just stable, alive, rooted, modest. Year 2 is when it rebuilds its frame and gives you real blooms again. And year 3, grown in living soil instead of propped up on quick feeds, it is often stronger and more disease-resistant than it ever was before it struggled. That is the trade. Not instant, but real and lasting, and it does not quit on you the following summer. Now I want to hear from you, because some of the best rose knowledge I know never came from a university. It came from people who had grown them for 50 years. So tell me down in the comments, what did your mother or your grandmother do for a rose that was struggling? A shovelful of compost? An old folk trick, something they would never explain but that always seemed to work? I read these, and I learned from them. And here is one to argue with me about, if you like. I think the fella at the garden center handing you a box of blue crystals for your sick rose is, with the best intentions in the world, giving you the worst possible advice for that particular plant. Tell me if I am wrong. I want to know. A few honest cautions before I let you go, because a lot of us are gardening in older hands, and sometimes around grandchildren. Everything on this list is a soil and plant treatment. None of it is a remedy for you. Nothing here goes in a cup of tea, please. Keep the manure fully composted and wash up afterward. And because roses, soils, and seasons differ so much from one town to the next, before you make any big change, check in with your local extension office and look up your USDA hardiness zone. And read the label on anything you buy. So that bare, hopeless-looking rose you were about to dig out? It is not dead. It is a plant that pulled its life down into its roots and went quiet, waiting for a better signal. Do not hand it a command to sprint. Give its roots a safe place to rebuild, feed the soil, and give it time. Come back in 3 or 4 weeks, and then again next summer, and I think you will be surprised who shows up. If this changed the way you look at that struggling rose even a little, subscribe so the next rescue finds you, and tell me in the comments which of the 10 you are starting with. Now go give that rose a reason to come back.